The storm began as a distant murmur, low rumbles of thunder and the occasional flicker of lightning on the horizon. By nightfall, it had fully arrived, roaring across the town like a restless beast. Rain slammed against the windows in waves, while the wind howled, rattling the old glass panes. I sat in the living room, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. My husband, Derek, was gone, attending a 3-day conference in another city. The house, usually warm and bustling with his presence, felt oddly hollow. Upstairs, his son Theo was in his room, likely tucked away behind his closed door as usual. It had been only a month since Theo moved in after graduating college. At 24, he was the picture of independence, though he carried an air of quiet reserve that made it difficult to know him. He was polite, always polite, but there was a weight to his silences, a barrier that seemed impossible to cross. Derek had insisted it was a temporary arrangement, a chance for Theo to figure out his next steps before leaping into the world. I didn't mind, or at least I told myself I didn't, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the house, an unspoken awkwardness that clung to every interaction. I reached for my book, though I'd been reading the same page for the past 20 minutes. My thoughts kept drifting, to Derek, to the storm, to Theo's quiet presence upstairs. It wasn't just the silence that unsettled me. It was the growing distance in my marriage, the way Derek's attention seemed divided lately. Perhaps it was the stress of his job, or the demands of having Theo back in the house. Or maybe it was something deeper, something I didn't want to name. The lights flickered once, twice, then cut out entirely. Darkness swallowed the room, save for the occasional flash of lightning outside. I fumbled for my phone, the glow of the screen barely enough to illuminate my surroundings. "Great," I muttered. I found the flashlight Derek had left on the kitchen counter and clicked it on. The narrow beam pierced the darkness, revealing the familiar contours of the house in stark relief. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the steady patter of rain and the distant growl of thunder. Upstairs, I heard movement, a soft creak of floorboards. It was Theo. I hesitated, the beam of the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. Should I check on him? The thought felt intrusive, unnecessary. He was an adult, perfectly capable of managing a power outage on his own. And yet, something pulled at me, a vague sense of obligation, or maybe just an excuse to break the oppressive silence. I climbed the stairs slowly, the flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The house seemed larger in the dark, each step an echoing reminder of its emptiness. Theo's door was ajar, the faint outline of light from his phone visible within. I paused just outside, unsure whether to knock or retreat. "Theo?" I called softly. "Everything okay?" There was a pause, long enough to make me wonder if he'd heard me. Then his voice came, low and even. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just reading." His tone was polite, dismissive, a clear signal that he didn't need or want my company. Still, I lingered, my hand hovering near the doorframe. "All right, let me know if you need anything." "Thanks," he replied, and the silence resumed. I turned back down the hall, feeling foolish for intruding. The guest bathroom was just ahead, and I decided to check the windows there. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and I wanted to make sure everything was secure. But when I opened the door, I realized too late that I had misjudged my location in the dark. The flashlight's beam swept across the room, revealing a tidy bed, a desk littered with books and papers, and a pair of sneakers neatly placed near the closet. Theo's room. My heart jolted as I realized my mistake. I moved to leave immediately, but something caught my eye, a faint light emanating from his laptop, which was propped open on the desk. The screen displayed a paused video call, the image frozen on the face of someone I didn't recognize. It wasn't the image itself that held me in place, it was the voice. Low and muffled, it continued speaking, as though the other person hadn't realized the call had been paused. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was intimate, almost confessional. I stepped closer, not entirely sure why. It wasn't curiosity, not exactly. It was something heavier, more instinctive. And then I heard it. My name. David. The voice was soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. My chest tightened as the sound of it echoed in the small room. I froze, torn between the urge to stay and the overwhelming need to leave. Before I could process what I was doing, I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me with a soft click. My mind raced as I made my way back to my own room, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly with each step. Why had my name been spoken? What had Theo, or his caller, been saying? The questions buzzed in my head like static, refusing to settle. By the time I reached my bed, the storm outside seemed distant, a mere backdrop to the tempest brewing inside me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into an innocent mistake. But as I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. The morning after the storm, the house felt different, quieter, heavier. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and thick, but the tension between Theo and me lingered, unspoken yet palpable. I made my way to the kitchen, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. Theo was already there, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. He glanced up as I entered, offering a polite nod before turning his attention back to the steaming mug. "Morning," I said, my voice sounding more strained than I'd intended. "Morning," he replied, his tone neutral, guarded. The silence between us stretched as I busied myself with the coffee maker. I was acutely aware of his presence, the subtle shift of his weight against the counter, the way his fingers drummed softly on the ceramic mug. "I hope the storm didn't keep you up too much," I said, attempting to fill the void. Theo shrugged. "I'm used to it. College dorms aren't exactly quiet during storms." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Every word felt like an effort, every pause loaded with things unsaid. My mind kept returning to the night before, the moment in his room, the voice on the laptop, the sound of my name. I stole a glance at him, hoping for some sign that he was thinking about it too. But his expression gave nothing away. He seemed composed, distant, as though the night had left no mark on him at all. Yet, there was something in his eyes when he finally looked at me, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Recognition? Curiosity? Whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving me to question whether I'd imagined it. "We should probably check the basement later," I said, forcing myself back into practicality. "Make sure it didn't flood." "Sure," Theo said, setting down his mug. "Let me know when you're ready." And just like that, the conversation ended. But the tension didn't. That afternoon, the power was still out, and the house felt colder despite the warmth of the lingering humidity. I suggested we find something to do to pass the time. Board games, maybe, or cards. To my surprise, Theo agreed, though his enthusiasm was subdued. We sat at the dining table, a deck of cards between us. The soft patter of leftover rain against the windows filled the silence as we played. At first, the conversation was stilted, small talk about his college classes, vague mentions of his plans for the future. But as the minutes passed, something shifted. Theo started to relax, his guarded demeanor softening. He even smiled once or twice, a rare and disarming expression that caught me off guard. I asked about his favorite books, and he told me about a novel he'd read in college that changed the way he saw the world. When I asked why, he hesitated, then said, "It made me realize how much we hide from ourselves. How easy it is to pretend we're fine when we're not." His words hung in the air, heavier than I'd expected. I nodded, unsure how to respond. "That's true," I said finally. "I think we all do that sometimes." Theo looked at me then, his gaze steady, almost searching. "What about you? What do you hide?" The question caught me off guard. My instinct was to deflect, to brush it off with a joke or a vague answer. But something in his tone made me pause. There was no judgment in it, no accusation. Just curiosity. "I guess I hide how lonely I feel sometimes," I admitted quietly, the words surprising even me. Even when I'm with people, it feels like I'm not really there. Like I'm disconnected. Theo didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was soft. Yeah, I get that. For a moment, we sat in silence, the cards forgotten. There was a vulnerability in the air, a fragile thread of connection that neither of us dared to pull too hard. That evening, the storm began to pick up again. The power remained out, and the house was cloaked in shadows, illuminated only by the flickering light of candles scattered throughout the rooms. Theo and I found ourselves in the living room, the sound of rain and distant thunder a soothing backdrop to our conversation. We sat on the couch, a single candle on the coffee table between us. The atmosphere was different now, warmer, more intimate. Theo had opened up in ways I hadn't expected, sharing stories from his childhood, his struggles to find his place in the world. I listened, drawn in by his honesty, by the quiet strength beneath his reserved exterior. At some point, I noticed how close we were sitting. Our knees almost touched, the faint glow of the candlelight casting soft shadows on his face. I wasn't sure when it had happened, when the space between us had shrunk, but I couldn't bring myself to move away. Theo leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now. It's strange, isn't it? How a storm can make everything feel different? I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. Yeah. It's like, it strips everything down. Makes you see things more clearly. He looked at me then, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. There was something in his expression, something raw, unguarded. I felt it too, that unspoken pull, the magnetic force that seemed to draw us closer even as every rational part of me screamed to stop. And then it happened. A fleeting touch, the briefest brush of his hand against mine. It was accidental, I told myself. It had to be. But the spark it ignited was undeniable. Theo pulled his hand back quickly, his cheeks flushing in the dim light. Sorry, he murmured. It's okay, I said, though my voice was barely more than a whisper. The moment lingered, charged and electric, before Theo stood abruptly. I think I'll head to bed, he said, his tone forced, controlled. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. As he left the room, the candlelight flickering in his wake, I sat there, my heart pounding. The storm outside had grown louder, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging within me. Whatever had just happened, whatever had almost happened, I knew it wasn't something either of us could ignore. The following morning dawned gray and heavy, the storm's remnants lingering in the air. I woke early, the restless night still weighing on me. My mind had churned with fragments of the previous evening, Theo's lingering gaze, the accidental touch, the way the space between us seemed to vanish as though it were inevitable. By the time I made my way to the kitchen, the house felt eerily quiet. Theo's door remained shut, and I couldn't tell if he was still asleep or intentionally keeping to himself. I welcomed the solitude, though it did little to settle the turmoil within me. I busied myself with brewing coffee, the rhythmic sounds of the percolator offering a brief reprieve from my thoughts. But the silence didn't last long. Footsteps approached, soft but deliberate, and I tensed as Theo entered the room. He looked tired, his usual composure frayed at the edges. "Morning," he said, his voice neutral but lacking the polite distance it usually carried. "Morning," I replied, forcing myself to meet his gaze. We stood there for a moment, the silence between us thick with unspoken tension. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the spell, but no words felt adequate. Finally, Theo gestured to the coffee pot. "Is there enough for two?" "Yeah," I said quickly, moving to grab another mug. "Let me pour you some." He sat at the table while I filled his cup, the small act of routine grounding me just enough to steady my nerves. When I handed him the mug, our fingers brushed briefly, and I pulled back too quickly, spilling a few drops on the counter. "Sorry," I muttered, grabbing a towel to clean up the mess. "It's okay," Theo said quietly. His tone was softer now, almost apologetic. We sat across from each other, the table between us feeling both like a barrier and an anchor. For a while, neither of us spoke, the silence filled only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. Finally, Theo broke the silence. "About last night?" My heart clenched at his words, and I gripped my coffee cup tighter. "Theo, no, let me say this," he interrupted, his voice firmer now. He took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly around his mug. "I think we both know that, whatever that was, it can't happen again." I nodded, relief and regret mingling in equal measure. "I know. It was a mistake. A moment of, I don't even know what." Theo's eyes met mine, and there was no anger in them, only a quiet sadness. "I don't want things to be awkward between us," he said. "But I think I need some space. To figure things out." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me like a lead blanket. "I understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to make things harder for you." For a moment, he looked like he might say something more, but then he simply nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. When Derek returned later that evening, the atmosphere in the house shifted once again. His presence brought with it a sense of normalcy, though it felt brittle, like a facade that could crumble at any moment. I greeted him with a kiss, the gesture feeling both familiar and strange. He seemed tired, preoccupied, but he smiled as he asked about the storm and how we'd managed without power. "Everything's fine now," I said, forcing a lightness into my tone. "Just a few long nights in the dark." Derek laughed, oblivious to the double meaning hidden in my words. He turned to Theo, who had just entered the room, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Heading out?" Derek asked. Theo nodded. "Just for a bit. Thought I'd grab some air." "All right. Don't be too late," Derek said, patting him on the shoulder. Theo glanced at me briefly before leaving, his expression unreadable. The door clicked shut behind him, and I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The days that followed were marked by a careful avoidance of anything that might disturb the fragile balance we'd managed to restore. Theo spent more time out of the house, and when he was home, our interactions were brief, cordial, and painfully restrained. I found myself focusing on Derek, throwing my energy into repairing the cracks that had begun to show in our marriage. We talked more, shared meals together, and even planned a weekend getaway to reconnect. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was a start. Still, there were moments when my thoughts drifted to Theo. I wondered what he was doing, where he went during those long hours away. I wondered if he thought about that night as often as I did, or if he'd already moved on, leaving it behind as a fleeting, insignificant mistake. A week later, Theo approached me in the kitchen, a suitcase by his side. "I've decided to move out," he said, his tone calm but firm. I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name, loss, perhaps, or regret. "Did you find a place?" "Yeah. A friend from college has a spare room," he said. "It's not permanent, but it'll give me some time to figure out my next steps." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "I hope it works out for you." "Thanks." He hesitated, his eyes meeting mine. "I think this is the right thing to do. For both of us." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to nod again. "I think so too." We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between us. Then, without another word, he picked up his suitcase and walked out the door. That night, as I lay in bed beside Derek, the house felt quieter than it had in weeks. The storm had passed, both outside and within, leaving behind a strange sense of clarity. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still wounds to heal, both in my marriage and within myself. But as I listened to the steady rhythm of Derek's breathing, I allowed myself to hope. Some storms, I realized, don't destroy, they reveal. And in the aftermath, you're left with a choice: rebuild or walk away. I chose to rebuild.